Hey, Chip here with Fly Oz. In this video, we're going to look at the airspace surrounding the Bentonville Airport. If you're planning a trip to Bentonville, and we sure hope you do, it's a good idea to take a few minutes to become familiar with the local airspace. It isn't overly complex, but it is congested, so we're going to do a deep dive and talk about some of the more nuanced parts of the airspace so you'll be comfortable when you come to visit. The Bentonville Airport is located 10 miles south of the Missouri state line and 20 miles east of the Oklahoma state line. We don't have a control tower, but we do have a lot of IFR traffic, and the airspace immediately around the airport is Class Echo, and that goes all the way to the ground. That means that VFR flight requires Class Echo visibility and cloud clearance, so operating a fixed-wing aircraft here anytime the ceiling is below 1,500 feet is questionable. This may be a good time to point out that our traffic patterns here are left-hand for both runways. So the airspace immediately surrounding Bentonville is pretty straightforward, but there are other airports nearby and their airspace factors in. XNA, the Northwest Arkansas National Airport, is about 6 nautical miles to the southwest and comes complete with its own Class Charlie airspace, and that reaches over the top of Thaden Field. You may hear controllers refer to XNA as National. Like Class Charlie airspace everywhere, there's an inner ring and an outer ring. The inner ring extends from the surface to 5,300 feet MSL, which is the top of this Class Charlie in all sectors. The outer ring, to the west and the south of Bentonville, starts at 2,500 feet MSL, and that's about 1,200 feet AGL. The unusual part of the airspace is the cutout to the east over Bentonville, and that starts at 2,900 feet. So the outer ring starts at 2 different altitudes depending on where you're located. The additional 400 feet to the base of the Class Charlie gives us a little extra room to maneuver. A lot of us here fly at 2,500 feet because it gives us enough altitude above the surface and provides some buffer below that outer ring over Bentonville. Remember that to enter Class Charlie airspace, you must establish two-way communication with the controlling agency. In this case, that's Razorback Approach, which means hearing Razorback respond to your call with your IN number. Now, ADS-B is also required to enter Class Charlie airspace or to fly over it, but it isn't required to fly under it. As I'll discuss later, communicating with Razorback Approach to arrive or depart is almost always the easiest and the safest way to fly around Bentonville. About 6 miles to the northeast of Thaden Field is Rogers Airport, and that's towered and of course is surrounded by Class Delta airspace. Some of that Delta airspace extends under our Class Charlie. The Delta airspace does have a cutout on the west side, and that gives you a little more room to operate without the risk of busting the Rogers airspace if you're paying attention. 11 nautical miles to the southeast of Bentonville is the Springdale Municipal Airport, and it's also towered, so there's another Class Delta airport to contend with. The same caveat applies here. Just paying attention to where you are in relation to the Class D airspace should keep you clear. There's plenty of room, but there's not much margin for error for the inattentive pilot. Less of a factor for us, but worth mentioning, is a third Class Delta airspace near Bentonville. That's the Fayetteville Airport. Once we consider the surrounding airspace, the green area represents the airspace that we can fly in without talking to anyone. That's a lot of airspace, but it doesn't have to be intimidating. There's a way to effectively eliminate the airspace with a touch of a button. I know that a lot of us treat the push-to-talk like an ejection seat, but using the radio is the easiest, safest way into and out of this airspace. Razorback has agreements with the towered airports in the area, so if you're talking to Razorback, then there's no need to contact any of the area towers. Razorback will coordinate with them and route you as needed. But just to be clear, the reverse isn't true. Talking to the tower doesn't grant you access inside the Charlie airspace. The tower can coordinate the handoff to Razorback, but you still have to establish two-way communication with them before you're legal to enter their airspace. Talking to Razorback takes all of the Class Charlie and the Delta airspace out of play. The time you would have spent staring at your moving map and maneuvering to stay clear, you can use looking for traffic and flying your airplane. Let's take a minute and talk about some of our airspace pitfalls you'll want to keep in mind when you visit. If you're departing from Bentonville, pilots are sometimes either not aware of the airspace to the west of them, or they lose situational awareness during the departure. Occasionally, we've had pilots who think that just because clearance delivery gave them a squawk code of the ground, that they're cleared into the Class Charlie. Regardless of who you talk to on the ground, you still must contact Razorback once you're airborne before you enter their airspace. For example, if you're departing on runway 18, a straight-out departure or departure to the west will place you in Class Charlie, so be sure to establish contact with Razorback first. Departing to the north, it's easy to forget that the outer ring steps down from 2,900 feet to 2,500 feet, and we've seen a few pilots who departed, made a turn out to the west, and then flew directly into the outer shelf. We see fewer pilots heading north entering Class Charlie inadvertently, but remember, there is a shelf overhead that starts at 2,900 feet. Be sure to stay below that until you're well clear. If you're inbound to Bentonville, at some point Razorback will switch you over to the CTAF frequency, and there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Let's say you're in Class C when you're told to go to advisory. Well, you're still fine in Class C even though you're on the CTAF frequency. But once you leave Class Charlie airspace, you can't go back into it without reestablishing radio contact with Razorback. That's something to remember when runway 36 is in use. The pattern for 36 is extremely close to the inner ring of Class Charlie. In this example, the base turn starts just a quarter of a mile east of the inner ring. Flying a wide pattern will put you inside of Class Charlie, and we've seen more than one pilot get released from Razorback just to fly back into their airspace without intending to. If there are other aircraft in the pattern, especially slow movers, and you feel like you're going to overtake them, it can put you in a situation where your options are limited. Pilots have tried to get some separation from aircraft in front of them by making a right 360, and they fly into the Charlie airspace. For all runways, but especially runway 35 and 36, it pays to make sure you have plenty of separation between your aircraft and the one in front of you. There are two other common ways we've seen pilots fly into Class Charlie without authorization. The first is by coming across the top from the east and making a teardrop pattern entry. The second is by extending the pattern to the south without being aware of where Class Charlie starts. There's a roundabout right at the edge of the inner ring. Don't fly south or west of that point unless you're talking to Razorback. It may seem like a lot when you first see it on the sectional, but if you'll take a few minutes before you get here to decide how you want to approach it, you'll find it's pretty straightforward. Talking to ATC makes it easy to get in and out. And remember, you can always contact us at FlyOz if you have questions about the airspace or if you want to talk about common procedures here. Thanks for watching and for respecting the airspace and other pilots. Be safe. Come see us.